Hey everybody, thanks for joining us for this virtual author event. My name is David Cramer, and I am here in South Bend, Indiana, where I'm a pastor at Keller Park Church, Mennonite Church congregation here in South Bend. I also work at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary over in Elkhart, and I'm here with Myles, my co-author.
Yeah, Myles Werntz. I am Associate Professor of Theology at Abilene Christian University, where I direct the Baptist Study Center as well. Been there for about a year and a half now. And this is our book. So happy that it's finally out and it's available in the world. So, David, why don't we start off by talking just a bit about what this book is and how it's organized, and let's see, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so this book, which I think my camera is like on the blurring feature, so I have to hold it up to my face so you can see it right. But it's called A Field Guide to Christian Nonviolence, Key Thinkers, Activists, and Movements for the Gospel of Peace. So it kind of is what the title says it is. It's giving a lay of the land of thinkers, mostly from the 20th and 21st century. And there's a lot of books out there that'll give like a argument for nonviolence, for Christian nonviolence, kind of an apologetic, if you will. And that's not really what this book is. So we're not really trying to start a fight here. We're pacifists, but we're just trying to describe a little bit more with more nuance what Christian nonviolence is, because I think we've both found that oftentimes it can kind of get flattened into a single view. And so we try to expand it as a living and breathing tradition rather than a single position.
That's right. So in the book, we do that over the course of these 8 streams. Broadly, I guess you could think of these in terms of the personal and the political. So you get into things like a nonviolence of Christian discipleship, a nonviolence of Christian virtue, the way in which mysticism and prayer relates to this, the ways in which nonviolence is described in terms of international relationships or internal politics of a nation. So, but what happens over the book is that though many of the figures are described in terms of belonging primarily to one stream, you begin to see very quickly that there's an interrelationship among these different streams, that it's not so easy to break down, say, where somebody like a Dorothy Day, where her commitments to prayer and her commitments to virtue end and her commitments to the body politic begin. There's just it's not as clean a distinction as that. And so the different figures are described as, we locate them primarily in one stream, but they tend to kind of wander all over the place.
Yeah, in a way, it's a bit of a bait and switch, because when you pick up the book, you see each chapter is a different one of these streams, and it can kind of look just by the table of contents like we're creating this new typology. And so if you think of classic typologies like H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, where he has these 5 different ways Christ interacts with culture, and they're very kind of rigidly distinguished one from the other. The table of contents suggests that that's what we're doing. We give these 8 different types. But then as you get into the chapters, you realize, oh, those are just kind of containers in which we can talk about all of these fascinating figures, and people don't fit perfectly within any one type. And so we try to use the language throughout the book of streams instead of types, because we really do see these different kinds of approaches to Christian nonviolence flowing together in a lot of interesting ways, diverging in interesting ways as well. But you might have somebody from like mysticism, nonviolence of Christian mysticism, heavily influencing somebody from nonviolence of political practice, even though, initially when you look at those 2 things, they seem like they couldn't be farther apart. And that actually is an example that I could cue Myles up to talk about, because there's an interesting connection with one of the most well-known advocates of Christian nonviolence, who was influenced by a lesser-known nonviolent mystic.
Right. So this gets into one of the I think the most interesting features of the book, is the way in which you find all of these interrelationships among the different streams in ways that the work of one person kind of refracts outward in a way that maybe they didn't anticipate. So what David is referring to here is the relationship between Howard Thurman, a lesser known but I think very significant figure of the 20th century, and Martin Luther King Jr. So Howard Thurman was a mystic, a pastor, a chaplain for a while at Boston University, where he interacted with the very young Martin Luther King Jr. So Howard Thurman was never one who was out marching with the civil rights movement. He devoted much of his work to religious life and to religious formation. Wrote a number of works on mystical encounters and mystical experience, but came to be a deep formative influence upon King, who took his work in a very different kind of direction. So mystical nonviolence, and we'll get into some of these things as we're going, but mystical nonviolence presumes that part of what we're doing when we pray is we're coming into contact with God in a way which transforms our desire for control in the world. We're coming into contact with God in a way which unclenches our hands toward our relationships toward God and toward others. And so Thurman is best known for his work, Jesus and the Disinherited, a book which King read, and legend has it kind of kept a copy with him when he traveled on the road. But King took Thurman's work as is better known, in a decidedly more political direction. And so using kind of the basis of Thurman's thought as a way to describe how people can exercise Christian nonviolence in public to leverage public opinion and public policy. So these streams interact with one another, and they begin to bounce around in some fascinating kinds of ways.
Yeah, so you mentioned, Myles, at the start how there's kind of this personal and political, or sometimes the distinction is like faithfulness versus effectiveness. So like one kind of nonviolence focuses on, this is the kind of community or the kind of person God calls us to be, and it's not as important how that might impact the wider world. That's just what we're called to do. And then this other form that we often associate with somebody like King is nonviolence is more of a tactic that's intended to move the needle or create some kind of revolution in the desired ends that you have. But I think one of the surprises, maybe for me, I'm not sure if this was a surprise for you, but in doing the research for this book, was that like those distinctions don't really hold up very well when you actually get down and look at the figures. And so King, even though he was very tactical and very smart about how he implemented nonviolence, he also realized that this is a spirituality. It's not just a tactic, and it might not always work, but it is kind of, the line, it wasn't original to him, but he popularized of the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. Like that's a statement of faith that the long game is going to go in that direction, even if in the short term, nonviolence might not appear to be as effective.
As working, right. Yeah, in his letter from a Birmingham prison, when he's talking about the different elements, like he specifically links together the need for spiritual discipline and prayer, and he links that together with a very prudential approach to employing nonviolence as a way of kind of like building tension, right? That it's designed and purposely to kind of to highlight inequities or to highlight things in society that need to be highlighted. So yeah, for him, this is a great example of the ways in which these things, which we're delineating within the book in order to help our readers kind of see the different streams that are here, to see that it's not all Christian nonviolence is not just kind of one thing, but it is a plurality of things and a plurality of approaches and figures, but that these things do converge and diverge in ways that are often unanticipated. So one of the questions that has popped up here is, what motivated you to write this particular book at this time? David, you want to kick us off talking a bit about how this book came to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when a book gets released, it can seem almost like the timing is super intentional. So, like, you could think, well, you know, the Afghanistan war wound down, and then this book comes out about alternatives to violence. I would like to think we were that.
We're not that savvy. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of fortuitous, but no, this book was really a long time in the making. We started talking about it over 5 years ago, and what happened was, so Myles and I met at Baylor when we were in our doctoral program together. Myles was a few years ahead of me, but we were both there working and writing on nonviolence, as part of our research. And there's a lot to the story, but to kind of shorten it a little bit, like, we kept running into examples of people who take different approaches to, like, just war, for example, with a lot of nuance and a lot of, like, distinctions, but then nonviolence just kind of gets thrown into this category with pacifism and non-resistance and just any kind of aversion to war, and it gets treated kind of simplistically. And um, I think we both kind of felt like there's a lot more to this tradition. It's not a simple position. Oftentimes it gets equated with this view from the radical reformers in the 16th century, who later become known as Anabaptists or Mennonites, where there's like this two kingdoms view of, like, Christians are called to live this one way. Jesus calls us to resist not evil, to love our enemy, to turn the other cheek, and all that type of thing. And then the world, the state, however you want to understand it, has a different call, and maybe the sword does have a place there. And so we kind of have our colony over here that responds with non-resistance, and we let the state do its own thing. And I mean, that view, there could be legitimate arguments for that view, but that would be like saying contemporary Lutheranism is whatever Martin Luther was writing
Whatever
about,
Martin Luther said, yeah.
in 1520 or whatever. Like, there's a lot of growth in these traditions, and that's what we found with nonviolence too. And we saw especially that the proliferation of kinds of nonviolence in the 20th century, as we're going through two world wars, nuclear proliferation, Vietnam War, like terrorism and all this type of stuff, because the forms of violence proliferate, the forms of responses to violence also proliferates. And this comes from so many different theological traditions. So in the book, we do talk about Mennonites and Anabaptists. They have a pretty prominent place, but you'll also find Methodists, Catholics, on down the line, different traditions represented. And we do talk about some white male figures that have also dominated the discussion, but we also try to uncover a lot of other figures from the majority world, Black authors, feminist authors, others. So just trying to provide a lot of texture to the reality of what nonviolence is. So that's kind of a circular way of getting back around to the question, but it just felt like it was treated very simplistically, and we wanted to kind of broaden what it is so we can have an authentic discussion, whether people agree or disagree with nonviolence itself.
Yeah, the other dynamic that's in play, and we mentioned this in the introduction, was that for the better part of 30 years or more, there was one figure in Christian circles that was predominantly associated. I mean, once you get beyond Martin Luther King Jr., within like a reading audience, there was one figure among all of them that pretty well dominated the field, and his name was John Howard Yoder. A lot of people during the 70s and 80s would read The Politics of Jesus, and that would be kind of their first exposure to Christian nonviolence and the ways in which this works. So in the late 2010s, a lot of revelations regarding Yoder's abusive behavior, his behavior toward women, came into full view. These are things that had been known for a long time, but weren't publicly and widely available. And so when that happens, like Christian nonviolence for so long had been linked so strongly to this one person, that the question really became prescient of like, okay, so what else is there? Is it all if Yoder is so centrally linked to this position, what do we do now? And so the Yoder is kind of a case of unintended consequences in terms of his own popularity, that he became such a notable figure in promoting Christian nonviolence that his shadow kind of eclipsed all of these other figures that were already doing really good and important work, such that when people think about Christian nonviolence, they usually, again, associate it with kind of this one central figure and the things that he wrote and the things that he said. And so that was kind of the other thread in terms of us pulling this book together, is to say, yeah, this has always been a broader conversation. And in the book, we discuss Yoder's work, but we discuss him alongside a variety of other figures that he depended on in his own work, but also figures that were maybe working in contradistinction to some of Yoder's own presuppositions. So,
yeah. And I think there's a confessional element to it as well, because we would both be the first to acknowledge that we were heavily influenced by him, as with many people coming up in Christian ethics when we were, as Myles said, like, it was known that there was something in his history. There was kind of like different gestures or acknowledgments toward that, but the whole story kind of wasn't well known. And so we had our own kind of personal reckoning with that while at Baylor. And then this book kind of, I don't want to give you the impression it's like all about Yoder, but there is this reckoning that happens in the book as well, where we start, the first chapter is on kind of the approach that he popularized, which is nonviolence of Christian discipleship. And that's what a lot of people who would have come into this this tradition through the politics of Jesus would really resonate with or kind of associate with nonviolence. And so in that first chapter, we say, yes, he's there, he's a prominent figure, we can't get around that in any way. But a couple things happen. One is there are a lot of other figures that are also writing about Christian nonviolence in a similar way. So we try to uncover some of those slightly lesser known figures. But then we go on in the rest of the book to say, even if you find nonviolence of Christian discipleship problematic for whatever reason, because of its association with Yoder or because of its way it utilizes scripture or whatever, like, you can potentially find other avenues into Christian nonviolence that we explore in the rest of the book. And so if your only understanding of it is this stream of nonviolence of Christian discipleship, we have 7 other ways of kind of getting into the discussion as well.
right. That's good. David, I'm always curious when we talk about this, like what about writing this book was the biggest surprise for you? Like, as we got into the writing of it, what did you find that you weren't anticipating to find?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, it's been a kind of surprise at my own personal evolution. As we mentioned, this book is probably, we hatched the idea over 5 years ago, so it was kind of a slow burn for a while, but it was something I was working on. We were working on together over the course of a lot of things happening in our own political context. And I think for me, like, my own draw toward being more activist, if you will. So like, you think of nonviolence, the caricature is that it's kind of not very activist, and we do try to break that down. But I found myself being drawn to some of the traditions that I think prior to researching for this book, I would have not been as drawn to. So like the second half of the book, there are aspects of the whole book that I resonate with for sure, but I found it interesting just reflecting in my own kind of self as a Christian, as a pastor, like how arguments that I might have dismissed a decade ago were starting to ring more true to me in light of our current political context.
Mm-hmm.
So how about you? How would you answer your own question?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. There's two of the streams that I found to be the most, like, personally challenging. So like you, I came to Christian nonviolence predominantly through the lens of Christian discipleship, and I think I would probably still identify with that pretty strongly. But the two that I find myself challenged by and resonating with more these days, they kind of move in different directions. The first one is the chapter on virtue. So that one of the folks beyond Yoder that wrote the most about Christian nonviolence in the 20th century was Stanley Hauerwas. So his emphasis was really the ways in which nonviolence and our character are interrelated. That it's not for Hauerwas only a matter of activity, but it is a matter of the way in which our character is being formed. And so I think that has always been like a key challenge for me, the ways in which that the actions that we take have to be matched with the kind of character that we have. This is something that the mystics also talk quite a bit about, the ways in which nonviolence is not just a matter of our character, but it's a matter of our prayer life. It's a matter of our personal devotion. I mean, again, to kind of reference back to the letter from Birmingham prison, this is something that King kind of saw comprehensively, and he kind of draws all these pieces together. But for me, kind of reflecting a lot on these figures has made me ask a lot more questions about my own life of prayer, my own life of virtue. So anyway, that's probably how I would, that's probably where I have been most challenged by the writing.
Cool. Yeah, I think one of the things that some readers might find surprising is who we include in the book. So like, you know, just to pull back the veil a little bit, we're each, writing first drafts and then sending them back and forth to each other. So I remember when you sent me the chapter on nonviolence of Christian discipleship, it was interesting to find Dietrich Bonhoeffer included in there, because I think a lot of folks who aren't as familiar with some of his writings about discipleship would think of him as like, are you sure he would be considered a part of the stream of Christian nonviolence? I mean, isn't he the assassin,
Right.
or whatever? So, or one of the chapters I worked on liberation, I ended up drawing a lot on Oscar Romero, who I think some people would probably say, well, he's not really a pacifist, which is true, but yet he has resources for the project of Christian nonviolence, and he was, even if technically a just war, person, like he was a significant figure in the development of what we call liberationist nonviolence. And so some of those decisions we made where it's like, you might not, it's like those old Christian posters, like, if you like this band, you'll love this band. Like you might not, if you like Bonhoeffer, you may love, Andrei Trockman or something, but yeah, so some of those decisions we made, I think, might disrupt the conversations a little bit, because it's not always as clear cut whether somebody falls in this stream of nonviolence or not. So I'm curious, maybe you're thinking around Bonhoeffer in particular, or other.
One of the figures that I think is pretty fun that there's several that I'm thinking of now that I'm happy that we included. One of the ones that I think is going to surprise people is Henry Naughan.
Oh yeah.
That Henry Naughan shows up in the book. So Henry Naughan, he comes into the chapter on mysticism because during the 70s, Naughan was extremely outspoken about violence that was happening in Central America, and so he has a number of speeches and a number of writings that he does along this lines. A couple of figures that I think will be surprising for people if you know the name Jacques Ellul. Perhaps you know him best for his writings on technology, or maybe his work on ethics in an urban setting. But he wrote quite a bit on nonviolence as well. So there's all these figures that have been obscured over time that we're trying to recover. And part of the aim, I think, of the book then is not to provide a definitive statement on what Christian nonviolence consists of, but rather to do kind of archaeology here, to kind of excavate some of these figures and to give them their due, and to now say, here are some ways in which you can go forth and read, right? Go forth and consider what this looks like for you.
So you named a few names, but I'm wondering who else, like as people encounter our book, hopefully, and they come across some names that are unfamiliar, like who do you need to go read next?
Oh man. So the one I'm gonna pick one that's better known, but I think is largely badly read, and I'm gonna pick one that is lesser known that people definitely need to read.
All right.
The one who I think people have heard of, but is always misunderstood, is Dorothy Day, like 100%. Uh, Dorothy Day is phenomenal. She is the real deal. So you should definitely go read her writings. You can start with like she wrote a couple of different autobiographies, but if you really want to understand kind of her writings on war, all of she wrote just thousands of essays across her life, all of which are available online at the Catholic Worker website. So she's electric. I love reading her because she challenges me every time I pick up anything that she wrote. The one who's probably a bit less known that I think people should pay more attention to, I'm going to go with one who shows up in the first chapter, and that is Andrei Trockman. I think his book, the name of which is escaping me at the moment.
Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution.
Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution. There it is. That one, if you have read Politics of Jesus and you go back and read Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution, you're going to be very surprised at how much overlap there is. And Trockman wrote his book 30 years before Yoder did his. And it's just wonderful. Trockman is one of these figures who kind of gets mentioned in footnotes and mentioned in kind of in passing, but just as a rich and vibrant figure, lived during the Second World War, he and his congregation helped to shelter thousands of Jews during the Second World War. Just a remarkable figure. So he would be the one, probably the lesser known figure that I would encourage people to go read. What about you?
Well, you kind of stole my thunder because I would also choose Trockman as one of them for sure. So I teach a class at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary called Christian Attitudes Toward War, Peace, and Revolution. And for many years, Yoder taught that class, and his book, Politics of Jesus, was often kind of in the required reading for that class. But when I kind of inherited the class and in the wake of the things we learned about Yoder, I decided to try to teach the class without making Yoder required reading. Like, it's not that I don't think anybody should ever pick up Yoder again or anything like that. It's just that, it felt important for me teaching at that seminary in that class to try to come at these questions without going directly through him. And so instead of the Politics of Jesus, when we got to kind of that period, I chose Trockman's Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution, and students just love it. And many of these students are, cradle Mennonites. Many are from other traditions, but it feels like a lot of people are attracted to it. And I think part of it has to do with he's writing in a very biblical vernacular. So like for seminarians, it really resonates.
But he's writing in a very distinctly reformed vein.
That's true. Yeah.
So it's very surprising to see the kind of what he does and some of the moves that he makes. I really resonated with that book and kind of the alterations that he makes. But
there's another study of Luke that I came across at some point in researching for this book that I couldn't believe I'd never heard of before, but I hope I don't mispronounce the name, but it's J. Massingberd Ford. And the book is My Enemy is My Guest. And when I first came across it, it was out of print. I was able to track down a copy, but I think now Whip and Stock prints it. So Baker Books, if you have it in your used section, plug for that. But this is another study of Luke, of nonviolence in Luke. And Ford was the first female theology professor at the University of Notre Dame right here in South Bend. So she's a trailblazer in the Catholic world of New Testament studies. And she comes at the question slightly differently. She engages kind of historical critical method a little bit more directly. So I think Trockman and Yoder both kind of take this fairly straightforward reading of the text, and she's kind of looking at the sources a little bit more, and kind of answers the question slightly differently, but still comes out with Luke's gospel at least advocating for something like nonviolence that we find in these other figures. So that was a revelation for me, for sure, coming across her. And one of my New Testament colleagues at AMBS now uses that in his class on Luke, and he's like a Luke scholar. So that's a legit study. And then another figure, so the very last chapter, we take a bit of a, I think, slightly newer turn in at least discussions of Christian nonviolence. And we talk about like resistance to sexualized violence. And this is a whole stream in its own right. And I don't know that everyone in this stream, well, I do know that they would not all consider themselves pacifist, or even be completely happy sort of being lumped into this whole Christian nonviolence discussion. But I think what they're doing is a form of resistance to violence that needs to be taken seriously. And one of the figures that I really think people should be reading, if they're not, is Tracy West. She's a womanist ethicist at Drew University, I believe. And so she's writing about Christian ethics centering the experience of Black women, and kind of how questions in Christian theology and ethics look differently when you have that starting point, as opposed to sort of an androcentric white starting point. Right. And so that was a challenge for me. She would not say like, women need to be nonviolent, but she would say, as a church and as a society, we need to be resisting and undoing violence. And so she's an important figure. She was gracious enough to write an endorsement for us. So we appreciated that. But so those are some people I would direct people to read.
We've got a question coming in as to whether or not we do anything with the witness of church history, in the sense that there's been an enduring witness to this from the early church onward. We really didn't do a whole lot with kind of the precedents prior to the 20th century. I think the furthest back we go is Rauschenbusch. I think he's probably the earliest figure that we discuss. And we did that primarily because we wanted to give, again, kind of so much of the modern, or like our contemporary understanding of Christian nonviolence has been obscured, and at least, well, maybe not. I'm trying to think how to phrase that. Like, has been there's been a large shadow that has kind of kept us from seeing, I think, broadly some other things that we could have been seeing. So that really took the focus. That led us to focus really on kind of the more recent history. So there has been a lot of work that's been done on kind of the ways in which nonviolence has been a feature of Christian faith and practice since the beginning. If you want a good book that gets kind of into say Christian nonviolence in the first 5 or 6 centuries, I would recommend to you George Kalantzis's book, Caesar and the Lamb. To me, that's probably one of the best versions that's out there. He does a lot of translation of primary text, and he really gets beyond kind of a lot of the tradition. So sometimes if you read this stuff long enough, you'll see people mentioning Tertullian and Origen from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but then they kind of drop it and say that there's really nothing else. Kalantzis is great because he really shows, he does the homework to show, nope, this is not just kind of some idiosyncratic position from 2 writers, but it really is, it's present in church canons, it's present in exegetes, it's present in all kinds of places and presumptions that you wouldn't necessarily have thought to look. But no, we don't really get into any of that because we wanted to leave the focus on the present period. But Kalantzis's book is great on the other stuff.
If you're joining us from Baker Bookhouse, another one that Baker published, which is down a similar alley as that, is Ron Sider's book, The Early Church on Killing. And so it's a reader. So he's compiling just a lot of those early church sources. And yeah, it's not just focused on 1 or 2 people, but it's kind of that whole cloud of witnesses, and it's about killing more broadly. So he's not only talking about war, but also things like capital punishment, things like that. So
Mhm.
that might be another one to look at. I think a lot of the figures we discuss would have different kinds of ways of engaging with church history. So
Mhm.
you might come across some of that indirectly in our book, but yeah, it's not really a first century to the present day kind of overview. We're picking up
Right.
pretty much at the start of the 20th century.
Yeah. Well, David, we got a few minutes left before you've got to go teach a class here in a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, any other things that our audience should know about the book, or about things that future directions for the book, future things that you want to see happen as a result of us putting this together?
Yeah, we've kind of joked about how we're probably going to have to do a second edition of this at some point, because it is really a living tradition, and so it continues to morph and change over time. So the conclusion to the book, we kind of do an overview of the 8 different streams, and kind of how they relate to each other. I think there's a lot more um, that could be done there for the reader to sort of think about those connections. And we didn't want to like answer those questions for the reader by saying the second stream and the seventh stream relate in this way. We wanted to leave that a little
Mhm.
more open-ended. But we do kind of end by looking at the doctrine of creation and how nonviolence might address issues related to creation care, climate change, and that type of thing. And so I imagine if we did a second edition of this in 10 years or 5 years even, that could be its own
Mhm.
stream. Is like climate nonviolence or something. I'm not sure exactly what the title
Right.
would be, but really seeing how violence, like, we often think of violence as a break from the norm. So like we have
Mhm.
normal peace and order and stability, and then there's a disruption of that when somebody attacks somebody else and there's bloodshed or what have you. But what we found through the course of this book project is violence and how we understand it is expanding, and necessarily like our understanding has to expand. And sometimes people think this is somehow like watering down violence. Like if you talk about economic injustice as a form of violence, then is the bloodshed violence still truly violence? But like I don't think of it as a watering down as much as it is an expanding of what violence really is. It's an opening of our eyes to what violence really is, because um, when people don't have access to nutrition and they develop diseases or die as a result of that, that's violence, even though it wasn't a sudden break from the norm.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that I mentioned Romero earlier. That's one of the things he exposes, is just the way violence in the context in which he's writing is just a part of the everyday life. It's what Matthew Whalen, who's a Romero scholar, calls ordinary violence.
Mhm.
And
There's another
so,
writer on environmentalism who calls it slow violence.
yeah,
The
so that,
violence is something that happens to a person, not just immediately trauma, but it's over time accomplishing the same sort of work.
yeah. And so in that last chapter, we do, or in the conclusion, we do tie in that notion of slow violence. And I think, you know, how we respond to that, if it's slow nonviolence or I don't know what it
Mhm.
is, but is going to be the crucial question for us
Right.
going forward,
Yeah.
because it affects so many different things. So my wife has a nonprofit here in South Bend, Neighbor to Neighbor, that works with refugees, and like she's learning more about like climate refugees, where people are living in part of the world where it's not so much that there was necessarily ethnic cleansing or a civil war, but it's just that there is no longer nutritious food or water available, so they have to
Mhm.
migrate. And I think that's going to be more and more the case. And so in as much as that is a form of violence, which I think it is, we need to do a lot more thinking as Christians about what nonviolence looks like in that context.
That's right. Yeah, we've got one more question before you go, if you have time for one more,
Yeah,
David.
sure.
The question is, do you see nonviolence as a topic that could or should lead to more meaningful ecumenical cooperation and exchange? And how might that look in terms of praxis?
So I'm going to let you
Uh,
take that one because you have a book
yeah,
on this.
yeah, right. So in my first book, Bodies of Peace, I deal with a figure named Robert McAfee Brown, who that was one of the things that he worked on primarily. He was an ecumenist, but he was also an advocate in a circumscribed way, in his own kind of peculiar way, of nonviolence. And so he saw nonviolence as really being kind of one of these things that could provide an entree into more ecumenical discussions. That if people can bear witness together to the peace of God in the world, then that opens up a space in which Christians can cooperate and begin to have, harder discussions about other doctrinal issues that might divide them. So kind of the premise is if God has come into the world, if God in Christ has come to create shalom, to create this peace among us, then this is a matter of praxis. It's a matter of us joining hands to oppose the forces of death and to oppose violence. But it also has to do with the ways in which we worship together, has to ways in which we reconcile our relationships to one another, and so that's all deeply ecumenical work. So my sense is that it can begin in that way. Again, kind of the civil rights movement with King is a great example here, in which you have folks from multiple traditions. You have Catholics and Baptists and Mennonites and Methodists, and they're all joining hands and working together, literally joining hands and literally working together for civil rights. And that common cause then, in the context of the 1950s and 60s, does lead to kind of a mini revival of ecumenism. So it's not surprising to me that those things tend to work hand in hand. So.
Yeah, as you were saying that, it reminded me that we do have a section in the chapter on realist nonviolence called the ecumenical potential of realist nonviolence. And so we do touch on that in the book. I think there's other places where we talk about that as well, but that's one thing for me, coming from the Mennonite tradition, that I think is a growing awareness, is like nonviolence isn't a possession of any one tradition.
Right.
And as much as we talked at the start about how it can kind of be pigeonholed as this Anabaptist Mennonite thing, I think there's also some of us from that tradition who also want to claim it. And when we see it spring up in other traditions, it's like, well, is that really nonviolence? And so I think this book in and of itself is something of an ecumenical gesture to say, like, we see it happening all over the place, all over the world, and in many different traditions. There is a contemporary movement that we talk about in the Realist Nonviolence chapter called just peacemaking, or sometimes the term peace building is used, and that's a ecumenical and even interreligious movement. And it's even bringing in people who would probably, if you force them to answer the question, might identify as just war advocates, but they want to be a part of this peace building project. And so there's even ecumenical potential across kind of the traditional pacifism, just war divide, of people who want to come together and work toward peace in the world and want to do that nonviolently, even if they might have theoretically, different answers on the question of violence. So, yeah.
Whether nonviolence is an absolute or is like a strategic tool in the toolkit. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, not seeing any other questions. I do need to get off to another class here, but it was great to chat with you, Myles, and hope all of you joining us learn something new about nonviolence, and we're enticed to go pick up a copy of this book. And if you do, order it through Baker Bookhouse.
That's right. That's right. Thank you to Baker Bookhouse for hosting us tonight, and look forward to hearing from you. If you have any thoughts, any reactions, we'd love to hear what you're thinking about the book.
Yeah, we're on social media and all that, so you can find us.
Okay.
All right. Have a good evening. We'll sign off.
All right.